The first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. Thomas Sowell. Welcome to the High Finance Podcast, where studying experts elevates expertise. Today we begin a deep dive into the foundational work of one of the 20th century's most profound thinkers on economics, Dr. Thomas Sowell, and his book, Basic Economics, A Common Sense Guide to the Economy. We are covering Part 1, Prices and Markets, the section where Thomas Sowell introduces his stark realities that govern all human societies. His central argument is that economics isn't a theory. It's a study of real-world consequences stemming from universal constraints. His approach strips away political rhetoric and focuses on how people, resources, and institutions actually behave under scarcity. The core of this section is captured in his famous observation that we mentioned before. The first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is disregard the first lesson of economics. That is a common theme you will see with Thomas Sowell, who believes in a free market and that more government intervention gets in the way of what's best for consumers and best innovation and productivity in society. We'll spend time exploring what scarcity really means, how the price system confronts it, and the disastrous consequences that inevitably follow when we try to ignore it. Let's get started with the most fundamental concept, scarcity itself. Chapter 1 in his book is titled, What is Economics? Sowell gives a definition that is concise and powerful. Economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses. Many people confuse scarcity with poverty or shortage. Sowell makes it clear that scarcity is a universal condition, not a political or social failing. Poverty is having few resources. Scarcity is when the sum of everyone's desires exceeds the sum of what is available. And so he goes to talk about even in the wealthiest nations, scarcity reigns. If everyone in America wanted a beachfront mansion, there simply aren't enough beaches. If every aspiring musician wanted a contract with the world's best record label, only a handful would succeed. The resources, beachfront land, record label executive time, studio space are finite. This means we are always forced to make trade-offs. Sowell's discussion of beachfront property is one of the clearest illustrations in basic economics of which scarcity is a permanent, non-negotiable economic reality and why prices are indispensable. So the reality of scarcity. Sowell starts with this simple physical truth. There is a fixed, finite amount of beachfront land. The number of people who desire to live in a beachfront mansion vastly exceeds the number of mansions that can physically exist. There's only so much beachfront property or beachfront land. The total supply is limited by nature. This is true regardless of the country's economic system, wealth, or political will. The indispensable role of price, given that there are more buyers than beach houses, a method of rationing must be employed. In a market economy, the price is the rationing mechanism. The high price of beachfront property is not a random occurrence or a sign of greed. It is a direct signal that the resource is extremely scarce and highly valued. The prices act as an allocator, ensuring that the scarce resource flows to those who value it most highly, as measured by their willingness and ability to pay. It is the mechanism that determines the trade-off. The failure of disregarding price, the unmet need, Sowell then asks what would happen if a government, deciding that housing is a right or that no one should profit from that necessity of shelter, imposed a price ceiling on beachfront homes, setting that price far below the market rate. The immediate and inevitable consequences would be no change in scarcity. The government decree would not create a single new inch of beach or a single new house. The government cannot create more beachfront property. The resource remains just as scarce as before they created this price ceiling. So then we would have a severe shortage. The number of people demanding the now artificially cheap houses would skyrocket, while the number of available houses remains the same or even shrinks as owners convert them or refuse to sell. A shortage develops. The rise of alternative rationing. Since the price can no longer perform its rationing function, some other less efficient and often more unjust method must take over. Sowell suggests this could involve a lottery. The house is allocated by random chance, ignoring who might use it most effectively or productively. Political favor. Houses are allocated based on political connections, bribery, or cronism. Waiting in line, a system of queuing or waiting lists, wasting people's valuable time. Sowell's conclusion is that the price system, while sometimes criticized for being unfair, is actually the most efficient and transparent way to handle the unavoidable reality of scarcity. Attempting to suppress the price simply hides the cost and introduces chaos, corruption, and new forms of unfairness into the rationing process. Sowell's conclusion is that the price system, while sometimes criticized for being unfair, is actually the most efficient and transparent way to handle the unavoidable reality of scarcity. Attempting to suppress the price simply hides the cost and introduces chaos, corruption, and new forms of unfairness into the rationing process. The story of the American middle class. Sowell notes that the American middle class today enjoys a standard of living in terms of access to food, medicine, and technology that would have been unimaginable to the richest of kings of just a few centuries ago. Yet people still feel constrained. Why? Because wants are limitless. Economics isn't about eliminating limits, it's about making the most of them. Because of scarcity, every choice involves a cost, not just a monetary price, but an opportunity cost. This is the value of the next best alternative that you must forego when you make a decision. Consider the resource of a medic's time and surgical supplies on a battlefield. There is no money involved, but the scarcity of resources forces a difficult economic calculation. A medic must decide who to treat immediately, who can wait, and who is beyond saving. The decision to spend 10 minutes stabilizing one soldier is the opportunity cost of not spending that time saving a different soldier. Resources must be allocated to their most valued use, even in life and death scenarios. We all face the scarcity of time. If you choose to listen to this podcast, the opportunity cost is the value of the time you could have spent studying, working, or exercising. Now let's talk about resources versus wealth. Sowell drives home the point that a nation's wealth is not determined by its natural resources, but by its economic system and its human capital, the knowledge and organization it possesses. He uses two countries and shows their contrast to make this example. Russia, or the former Soviet Union he discusses in the book. This vast country is arguably the most resource-rich on the planet, with staggering reserves of oil, gas, timber, and minerals, yet under a system of central planning that disregarded market signals, it often struggled to provide basic goods for its citizens. Its abundant resources were wasted or misallocated because the system during the Soviet Union time lacked the crucial information and incentives to use them efficiently. By contrast, Japan is a small island, nation notoriously resource poor. It imports nearly all its oil, iron, ore, and other raw materials, yet through superior economic organization, heavy investment in human capital, education and skill, and a reliance on market prices, Japan transformed those imported raw materials into high-value electronics, automobiles, and machinery, creating one of the wealthiest nations on earth. Sowell's contrast between the resource-rich former Soviet Union and a resource-poor Japan is a powerful way to demonstrate that raw materials are not the same as wealth. The key detail to add how the respective economic systems played out. Central planning versus market prices. Failed or succeeded in allocating resources. Now let's break down in even further detail the failure of central planning. The Soviets' economies' persistent failure stemmed from its complete disregard for the price system. as a signal and incentive. Under central planning, production targets were set by bureaucrats in Moscow, where you could potentially be punished for not meeting quotas. They had no accurate information regarding local scarcity or consumer desires. They could not know the true opportunity cost of using a ton of steel in a tractor factory versus a construction project without market prices. The central planners were essentially flying blind. Plant managers were rewarded for meeting quotas in a raw physical terms, such as producing tons of nails or miles of cloth, not for producing goods that were actually useful or even desired by consumers. This led to absurd outcomes. Nail factories produced enormous quantities of tiny, unusable nails because they were easier to produce and helped meet a quota measured by weight. Factories produced machinery that sat unused for years because the specification, the scarce knowledge, were wrong or failed to match the needs of the end users. Chronic waste and shortages. Despite having vast oil reserves and timber forests, the lack of price signals meant resources were wasted, in some sectors producing useless goods, while shortages persisted in others, basic food and durable consumer goods. The wealth was there, but the economic system lacked the knowledge transfer mechanism, the price to deploy it productively. Now let's talk about the contrast in Japan, which shows the triumph of knowledge and efficiency. Japan, by contrast, possesses virtually no domestic reserves of crucial industrial resources. Its success story validates Sowell's point that knowledge and organization are the ultimate scarce resources. Prices drive allocation. Japan's market-based economy relied on a global market prices for its imports, oil, iron ore. These prices provided instant, accurate signals of global scarcity. When oil prices rose, every Japanese firm and consumer was immediately incentivized to conserve energy and innovate. Investment in human capital, because natural resources were scarce, Japan poured resources into its people, creating highly educated and skilled workforce, human capital. This skilled labor was able to take cheap imported raw materials and transform them into globally high-valued, high-quality products. We see these everywhere in today. Cars, cameras, microchips. Maximizing value add. Japan excelled at a value add production. The resources it imported were used for their highest valued alternative use, a process constantly steered by profit and loss incentives. The result was an economic miracle driven by efficiency, adaptability, and an acute awareness of global market signals. Sowell summarizes that the decisive difference wasn't the material wealth which Russia had, but the effectiveness of the decision-making process. The Soviet system concentrated power and knowledge in the hands of a few planners, whereas the Japanese system used prices to decentralize knowledge and allow millions of individuals and firms to make informed trade-offs. Knowledge, Sowell argues, is often the most critical, scarce resource of all. An efficient market system is simply a superior technology for disseminating and utilizing the decentralized specific knowledge. Sowell's conclusion: the difference in wealth between the two countries isn't what they started with in the ground, but the knowledge and efficiency they brought to bear on those resources. Knowledge, Sowell argues, is often the most critical, scarce resource of all. Now let's further dive into the genius of the price system. If scarcity is the problem, the market's answer is the price system. Sowell argues that prices are the most effective means of coordinating the economic activity of a complex society. Prices perform two fundamental interconnected roles simultaneously. They are a signal and an incentive. A price isn't just about how much money you hand over. It's a transmitter of condensed, vital information. A high price for copper doesn't just mean higher costs. It signals that copper is scarce relative to its demand across the entire global economy, from construction to electronics. No central planning committee could ever gather this dispersed information as quickly or accurately as the price itself. This signal creates an immediate incentive. When the price of copper rises, producers are incentivized to search for new sources or increase extraction, while consumers are incentivized to use less copper, finding cheaper substitutes like aluminum or fiber optics, or simply defer non-essential projects. This automatic decentralized adjustment happens with millions of products every day. He has this great quote in the book. The price system is an automatic mechanism for coordinating the economic activities of millions of people who have no knowledge of each other. When we discuss coordinating production and consumption on a global scale, the price system links different parts of the economy seamlessly. Sowell illustrates this with a complex global web required to make an everyday product. So let's talk about the story of the pencil. Imagine the resource that goes into a simple wooden pencil. Graphite from a mine in China, cedar wood from a forest in Oregon, rubber for the eraser from a plantation in Malaysia, yellow paint and brass for the furrow, the metal band from various industries. No single person or central planning agency knows the optimal mix or location for all these inputs. But if the price of cedar wood suddenly rises due to, say, new forestry regulations or increased demand for homes, pencil manufacturers get an immediate signal. They are incentivized to use less wood, find a cheaper timber, or perhaps even increase the price of pencils. This micro adjustment saves the scarce cedar wood for its highest valued uses, perhaps home construction, all without a government directive. This is the invisible hand working in real time. As we go further into the book, Sowell discusses how losses are as important as profits. Sowell insists that you cannot understand the power of the price system without understanding the necessity of losses. Profits are the reward for allocating resources efficiently and producing what consumers want. Losses are the penalty for allocating resources inefficiently or producing goods consumers no longer want. Losses are society's way of ensuring that resources, labor, land, capital are taken away from failing firms and reallocated to more productive uses. The firm that consistently incurs losses will eventually be forced to close, freeing up its factory space, equipment, and a workforce for a business that can use them to create more value for consumers. Losses are the economic discipline that purges waste from the system. Now, to really drive home this point, Sowell talks about the importance of losses using an example and the rise and fall of retail giants. To see how losses serve society, we can look at the history of retail, a story of continuous change driven by economic discipline. Consider the dominance of A&P, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company in the early 20th century. A&P pioneered the low-cost, high-volume chain, but its model was suited to an earlier era. Smaller stores in dense city centers, facilitating the daily shopping trips that were necessary before modern refrigeration. This model generated enormous profits for decades. Then three interconnected technological and social changes occurred simultaneously, rendering A&P's efficiency obsolete. Suburbanization. The rise of the automobile allowed families to move out of the dense city centers. Home refrigeration. Crucially, the widespread adoption of refrigerators in private homes freed consumers from the necessity of shopping every day for perishable items. They could now buy in bulk and store food for a week or more. And in-store technology. The new supermarket model like Kroger and Safeway leveraged this change by building huge stores on cheap suburban land and equipping them with massive, efficient refrigeration and display cases. The A&P model, with its small city footprint and focus on frequent, small purchases, became massively inefficient. The new supermarket model, by combining the consumer's home refrigeration with the store's scale and location, dramatically lowered the cost, time, effort, and money of groceries for the customer. The loss mechanism. As consumers migrated to these new, technologically superior markets, A&P's inner city stores began to incur losses. These losses weren't an accident. They were the market's loud, clear signal. The resources used by the old A&P model, the specific urban real estate, the inventory system, are no longer being used to the highest valued use, forcing reallocation. These mounting losses force A&P to either adapt drastically or shrink. In shrinking, the losses compelled them to close stores, which freed up the urban real estate and labor for newer, more efficient enterprises. The thriving suburban chains like Kroger and Safeway became the new retail giants by effectively combining technology, location, and scale. Sowell's takeaway in this was, if the government had intervened to shield A&P from losses, we would have been stuck with a less efficient retail system, and society's scarce resources would have been locked into a suboptimal use. Losses are the societal mechanism that cleanses the system, ensuring that resources aren't constantly directed from failing enterprises to thriving one. A process economist Joseph Schumpeter, who I hope I'm saying his name right, famously called creative destruction. The losses of the old firms enable the creation of the new. Now that we talked about chapter 1 and chapter 2, we're going to take a pivot into the consequences of price controls. Chapter 3 turns to what happens when we try to politically override the signals sent by the market price controls. Sowell argues that regardless of the noble intention, the economic consequences are overwhelmingly negative. A price ceiling sets a maximum price below the equilibrium market price, usually to make a necessity affordable. But Sowell demonstrates that if it only makes the product scarce. So he talks about this example in-depth story about rent control in New York City. The classic devastating example of a price ceiling is rent control, seen for decades in cities like New York City and San Francisco. Increased demand, reduced supply. By setting the maximum allowable rent far below the market rate, politicians greatly increase the quantity demanded. More people want these cheap apartments, but drastically decrease the quantity supplied. Landlords have less incentive to build new units or maintain existing ones. So now you have a deterioration of quality. Sowell notes that rent control doesn't just reduce the number of apartments, it reduces their quality. Since a landlord cannot raise the rent to recoup the cost of a new roof or a plumbing overhaul, their incentive is to let the building deteriorate. The rent-controlled apartment becomes cheaper, but also often older, dirtier, and more run down. And then you have a rise of the non-price competition. Since money cannot retain the scarce housing, other less efficient methods take over. Waiting lists. Tenants can spend years on lists. Bribes or under-the-table payments. A black market develops where tenants pay a key money bribe to the landlord or previous tenant. Personal connections. Apartments are allocated based on who you know, not who values the apartment the most, as measured by willingness to pay. Wasteful consumption. Older residents whose children have moved out are economically incentivized to keep their spacious, cheap apartments even if they no longer need the space, meaning the housing cannot go to a young family that desperately needs it. So his verdict is the rent control does not abolish scarcity. It merely shifts the burden. It benefits a small group of existing tenants at the expense of all future tenants and the quality of the housing stock. Now let's switch to price floors. A price floor sets a minimum price above the equilibrium market price. The most common price floor is the minimum wage, a floor under the price of labor. The intention is to ensure workers are paid a living wage. Sowell asks us to look at the consequences. The zero wage. Sowell's most famous critique is the real minimum wage is always zero, regardless of the laws, and that is the wage that many workers receive in the wake of the creation or escalation of a government-mandated minimum wage. The employer's calculation. A business hires a worker only if their worker's productivity is worth at least the wage plus benefits. If the government raises the wage floor above the productivity level of an entry-level or low-skilled worker, the employer is faced with an unavoidable loss. The most rational economic decision is not to hire that worker at all. Unemployment is the surplus. The result is a surplus of labor, which we call unemployment, particularly among teenagers, minorities, and the least experienced workers whose productivity has not yet risen to meet the mandated wage. It effectively makes it illegal for a business to hire someone whose work is valued at $8 an hour for an $8 an hour, condemning that person to zero income. Sowell uses an international example and agricultural price supports to drive his point home. Sowell also cites agricultural price floors supports common in the US and Europe when governments guarantee farmers a price above the market rate. Farmers are incentivized to produce more and more, which causes a surplus. The government then has to buy and store mountains of butter, grain, and milk, often letting it rot, a monumental waste of scarce resources to keep the price floor effective. He uses the historical example, the French Revolution and black markets. To underscore the futility of controlling prices, Sowell recalls the early history of the French Revolution when the law of the maximum imposed price ceilings on bread and other food that predictable happened. Farmers hoarded. Farmers saw the price control and realized the government mandated price was below their cost or what they could earn themselves, so they refused to bring their grain to the city's official markets, the unseen black market. Instead, a massive black market emerged where food was sold illegally at much higher prices. The city starved while the food was still available just outside, hidden away. The government's attempt to fix the price did not fix the problem of scarcity. It merely changed the way the scarce good was allocated from a transparent market price to an inefficient system of bribes, hoarding, and high black market prices. So he again talks about how government control always has unforeseen economic consequences that free markets usually alleviate. In the final part of this section, Sowell resolves the confusion between cost and price and summarizes the role of competition. A critical distinction Sowell insists upon is the difference between a cost and a price. Price is what the consumer pays. Cost is what society sacrifices in terms of scarce resources. Example, healthcare. When politicians promise to lower the price of healthcare, they are often talking about lowering the patient's out-of-pocket payment through subsidies, but this does not lower the cost to society. The cost of training doctors, building hospitals, conducting medical research, and producing complex drugs. That cost is simply transferred to taxpayers, insurance companies, or future generations. By lowering the price paid by the consumer, you incentivize them to consume more of the resource, more tests, more appointments, further driving up the true cost to society. Sowell's insight is confusing price with cost leads to massive economic confusion. Low prices are great, but if they don't reflect low cost, they are merely a financial illusion hiding an economic burden. He then transitions into the role of competition. Competition is the driving force behind the efficiency of the price system. Competition for producers, businesses are forced to innovate, reduce waste, and improve quality to survive. Competition for resources, buyers compete with each other for scarce resources. When a home builder buys lumber, they are competing with a furniture maker for that wood. The price system allocates that scarce wood to the buyer who values it the most, ensuring the lumber is put to its most productive use. This constant multi-layered competition ensures that resources flow to their most effective application, improving the overall standard of living. Competition is the driving force behind the efficiency of the price system. Sowell illustrates that competition isn't just about firms fighting for customers. It's about scarce resources fighting for buyers and buyers fighting for scarce resources. He has this in-depth story about competition versus price controls in transportation. Sowell uses the history of U.S. transportation to show that regulating prices not only prevents efficiency, but actively misallocates resources and hurts consumers. The railroad example stifled competition. The U.S. government, through the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, regulated railroad freight rates starting in the late 19th century. The goal was to prevent railroads from exploiting their regional monopolies. However, this regulation quickly became a barrier to progress. Intermodal competition as trucking and river barges became more efficient. Railroads were legally prevented from lowering their rates to compete. This was a critical failure to adapt. The high fixed price destroyed the incentive for railroads to innovate or find cost savings. Consequently, freight that could have been moved more cheaply and efficiently by rail was unnecessarily moved by truck, wasting fuel and labor. Indirect competition. They have another example for coal. The regulated freight rates on coal made the delivered price of coal artificially high. This artificially high cost made oil and natural gas more competitive than they should have been. The regulated system therefore diverted scarce resource toward oil and gas extraction when the free market might have chosen coal, leading to a poor allocation of society's energy resources. The ICC have essentially protected the existing structure from the forces of innovation, forcing society to pay a higher overall cost for transportation and energy. He also talks about the airlines, the triumph of deregulation. The same logic of regulation was applied to the airline industry by the Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB, which for decades controlled routes and airfares. The result was the same as the railroad industry: stagnation and high prices. The regulatory squeeze under the CAB, airlines were not allowed to compete on price. If two airlines flew the same route, they had to charge the same fare. Competition was forced into wasteful, non-price forms, excessive meals, fancy lounges, and half-empty flights, all of which drove up the true cost of air travel. A plane flying with many empty seats meant that scarce capital and fuel were being wasted. The change became during the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, began the process of eliminating the CAB's control over routes and prices. This change provided a dramatic real-world economic experiment. The consequence, once airlines were free to compete on price, a massive reallocation of resources occurred. Airlines rapidly dropped fares, developed the efficient hub and spoke system instead of inefficient point-to-point routes, and introduced lower cost models. The ultimate result was a massive increase in efficiency and volume. The number of people flying skyrocketed, and real inflation-adjusted airfares plummeted. Sowell uses this contrast to show that competition is not chaos. It is information and incentive. Where the railroad regulations fostered waste and stagnation, deregulation in airlines fostered efficiency and accessibility. The immediate and sustained growth in air travel proved that the high prices under regulation were simply preventing the efficient use of scarce airline resources. This constant multi-layered competition ensures that resources flow to their most effective application, improving the overall standard of living. We've covered the entire first part of Sowell's basic economics, tracing the logic from the profound reality of scarcity to the power of the price system and the predictable failures of price controls. This journey has shown us that economics is fundamentally about the consequences of choice. Let's quickly review the core economic tenets Dr. Sowell insists we internalize. Scarcity is reality. The fundamental economic problem is that resources are finite and have alternative uses. This forces all societies, rich or poor, to make trade-offs. Prices are information. In a market economy, prices are the most effective, dynamic signal of relative scarcity and value, coordinating the production and consumption of millions of goods without the need for central authority. Incentives matter. The profit and loss system provides the essential discipline. Profits reward efficiency and innovation. Losses are vital, forcing the reallocation of scarce capital and labor away from wasteful uses. Consequences follow intentions. Policies that ignore the first lesson of economics, like price controls, inevitably lead to unintended negative consequences, such as shortages, waste, and reduced overall efficiency, regardless of how compassionate their stated goals may be. Sowell is ultimately a champion of clarity over sentiment. He urges us as financial experts and engaged consumers to look past superficial labels and emotional appeals, instead focus on the system of incentives a policy creates and the demonstrable consequences it generates in the real world. The core lesson for all investors and business leaders in this: economic laws are not political decrees. You can legislate a price, but you cannot legislate supply, demand, or productivity. I'll leave you with one final powerful Sowell quote to ponder as you look at economic news this week. Much of the social history of the Western world over the past 3 decades has involved replacing what worked with what sounded good. Now, on that note, thank you for tuning in to the High Finance Podcast. We hope this deep dive into Thomas Sowell's principles gives you a clearer lens through which to view market forces and government policies. Until next time, keep studying the experts and you'll keep building your expertise.